Oh, okay.
And thanks for coming. Okay. My internet is good.
Hopefully. See. I guess we start then. Thank you guys. Should I wait for more people, you think? Or?
I think we can start about after 5 minutes, maybe.
Okay.
Okay. No.
For those who are here, we'll wait about 5 minutes and see if anybody else comes. Okay, we'll get started. Just first off, can everybody hear me? You guys can say it out loud because I can't see any chat. Is it working? Can you guys tell me if you can hear me, please?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Carolyn. This is User-Centered Design. We're going to talk about how we can make our user interfaces easy for people to get started with and not have to have a lot of text or instruction manuals in order to help people understand what we're trying to do and get themselves immediately working on their goals. And we'll explain why all of this is important, and I'm sure a lot of it you know just from trying to use other people's websites and other people's apps and being confused about what to do next. So these are just some tools and principles to help you design interfaces that are better than that. So to start with, like I said, I'm Carolyn. I'm originally from the US and I'm a master's student at MIT. I also did my undergrad there and in computer science. Right now I'm working on machine learning, but I really enjoy user experience, and I've spent a few years in industry working on Android apps. So I have seen this stuff in the wild and done some real user testing on those users for those Android apps. Your other instructor you'll see probably next week is Tugsu, and he's from Mongolia. He's a fourth-year student at MIT, also in computer science. He's focusing on machine learning right now as well, but he's also taken some courses on user experience. We actually have very similar backgrounds, so you'll see him and you'll see me, and we have a lot of the same knowledge on this, so feel free to ask either of us questions. So this is our first class today, Thursday, January 17th, and our last class will be the 31st, so 2 weeks from today. And we'll meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. I know we started a little late today, but I'll try to be more on time the next few lectures. Maybe 5 minutes after the start of class, we'll get started just so everybody has a chance if you're a little bit behind schedule. So 2:05, we'll start every Tuesday and Thursday. And it'll be 2 hours of lecture. There will be work that I'll tell you about at the end of the lecture, but this is all optional since it's online. I can't check up that you're actually doing it. So I think it's valuable work, and I think you should try to do it if you have time, but definitely optional. So we'll start today with usability and learnability. These are the two main principles of designing for users and putting your users first when you design a user interface. And the optional work for tonight, this weekend, whenever, is to find a few examples out in the wild, on the web, in apps that you use on your phone of good and bad design. And I'll explain more about that at the end of the lecture. Next week, we'll talk about efficiency and safety, just more main principles of usability. Those three major ones are the things that we'll always keep coming back to as we design our prototypes and do user testing. So that's lecture 2 for next week. We'll talk about the things that you should be thinking about when you prototype, how to design a user test so you don't influence the users, but you also get the most information out of it that you can. And your optional work for that will be to actually brainstorm some project that you want to work on and build a prototype and then user test on your friends, whoever you can find. If you can find the real type of user that you want to be designing this for, that's great. So if you want to design, I don't know, a shopping app, if you can find somebody who loves to shop online and test with them, that's the ideal user for that. In week 3, we'll go more into actually how visually pleasing your design is. So colors, text, how easy it is to read, placement of buttons, things like that to make your website look pretty or your app look pretty, because that's as important to a user as anything else. And there's definitely some science behind it, but a lot of it is also personal choice. And so I'm not always great at the personal choice part of that, but I can speak to at least the theory behind why you place buttons in a certain way or choose a specific text. Then we'll talk about internationalization, which is important here, since I'll be teaching in English, but most of you guys do spend most of your lives in Kazakh or Russian, right? So internationalization is how you translate for your users text on a website or text in an app, how you, for some languages like Arabic, you want to have, you will have to show text right to left, so your whole interface gets changed from being a left to right design to a right to left design, which is a pretty interesting challenge. And there's tools out there to help you with this. We'll talk about a few of those things, mostly probably in Android because that's what I know best. And then lecture 3 will be accessibility. So if you have a user who's blind or can't type for some reason, different things like that, how can you design an interface so that different kinds of people with different abilities are able to use it just as well as anyone else? And for that, your optional work will be to design your own personal page for the graphic design part, and then internationalize and add accessibility to your design from week 2 in your prototype. And if you want to, doing additional user testing on those changes would be great. Are there any questions about that stuff before we go on? Sorry. Okay, I'm going to assume no questions. Oh, yep.
So it's online lecture. If I'm going to attend it offline, should I present here right now? I just didn't got it.
You're going to attend the offline class tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we'll do the same lecture tomorrow, and then we'll also have a lab.
Oh, great. So tomorrow we'll have 4 hours, 2 hours of lecture and 2 hours of practice, right?
Yes, yep.
Oh, great. Thank you. Then I can come go out, so I will meet you tomorrow at SDU.
Oh, okay, sounds great.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye.
Bye. Does that mean, do we have anyone else? Yeah. Okay, any other questions from anyone else? Okay, great. We'll continue then. So I have a quick survey, but I noticed there's only 2 people left. So we can I'll just ask you quickly, do you have any background in graphic design, in user interface design, in building websites, any sort of related background? Can't tell. Okay, great. Now that I have some background on everyone here, we can keep going, and if you have a chance to take this survey at another time, that'd be awesome, just so I have all the information in one place. But thanks for talking with me. So today we're going to go over the major principles, like I said, usability and learnability. So the first one, usability, is the overarching idea that we're always going to come back to, and that's just how easy is your interface to use. And the three things underneath of it are all parts of usability that are really important, but the overall score that you're looking for is how easy is your interface to use. So the first one today, so what is usability? We want to make sure we have all of our functionality. We don't want it to be, for an app, a mobile app, we don't want it to be crashing. So that's when that pop-up comes up and says the app has stopped. So that interrupts the user experience, and it's not easy to use because at that point, the person just can't use it at all. For a website, that's things like, something went wrong, a 404, maybe it's really slow to load. There's a lot of different things that can go into that, and some of those are more technical trade-offs, like are you using too much data in your back-end design or something like that. And you don't want it to be expensive. That's another issue that can be related to how much data you're using. You don't want it to tax the user's device or maybe their phone plan. So that's one thing to think about. And as I said, the overall thing that we're going for is how easy is the system to use. And that includes all of our functionality, all of the main tasks that we want a user to be able to do. We want them to be as easy as possible to learn, to use once they've learned it. And if they make a mistake, we want to be able to fix the mistakes. So those are the three main things. So we'll start with an example, the user interface Hall of Shame. So we look for, this is one example of something that is out there in the world that wasn't designed very well. So the first thing we want to do is we want to ask what's wrong with it. And I know that one of our users is just on chat, so let's do this by chat. So let me get the chat going. Okay, so we have a couple answers in a private chat. So one of them is the text, this really big, long side text. Anytime you find yourself writing a lot of text like that, oh, all of these should not be here. Let's get rid of those so you can't actually see. Anytime you find yourself writing a lot of text like that, that probably means that you've done something wrong in your interface, because the interface should explain itself. When the user looks at this, they should automatically know what to do. Another thing that this student said is control. So I think what that means is this control right here. So what you would see if this was a working interface is that if I scroll this over, it'll change the picture here. And so, can you see my mouse moving? Okay, good. So the picture here would change to show you a new type of certificate that you're going to see. Oh, you can't see my mouse. Okay, I'm pointing at the scroll bar at the bottom of the certificate. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize you couldn't see my mouse moving. So the scroll bar, if I were to scroll it a little bit to the right, it would change the picture that shows in the certificate area. And that's how a user would select what certificate they want to create. So one thing that doesn't make sense there is if I know which certificate already that I want to use, I'm not able to find it quickly because I can't just choose a name of it or choose a number of it. I have to scroll until I find it. So that makes it difficult in the future for a user who's already learned the user interface, it makes it difficult for them to use later on. Anything else that we see? Yeah. I think that's good for now. I mean, there's also a lot going on here. Part of that is the big text. But it is good that the user can immediately see the style of the certificate, right? They don't have to click OK in order to see what their certificate looks like. They can see it before they select which one they want. So that's one thing that was done well here. I'll put our text back so we can see. Yeah, so we talked about all of this. The scroll bar suggests continuous. So continuous as in maybe each time you scroll a little bit, I don't know, certificate of achievement changes its shape or something. But what really is happening is this is a discrete selection. So as soon as I scroll, it's going to be an entirely new certificate. Yeah, so some things we can fix. We'll just go through this directly. So this is a better way to do it. As I said, we have a more discrete selection process, and I can see all of my options before selection. So certificate of achievement, create your own award. I can select based on the type of certificate I'm trying to create instead of having to scroll until I find which one I want. There's also a highlight to tell me which one I've currently selected. So I'm providing the user with feedback after they click that they've actually made the action that they wanted to make. And we also were able to remove our giant text, which is always a good thing. Just like in creating a PowerPoint, less text is always better. All right, so let's go to our next one. Remove my notes again. So for this one, what do we see that is bad about this interface and what could we fix? This is the interface to set time for an alarm. Okay, I don't see any answers yet, so we'll just talk about it. So for setting the date, you would think based on these text boxes that I can just highlight the way the time has been highlighted and type in the change that I want to make. But what you actually have to do is click on the button, and then something like the lower interface showing the clock will come up, and that's where I actually select my time. That doesn't make very much sense because the text box and the fact that I can highlight the text, that usually means that I can edit the text. So there's an issue with consistency there. And then in the picture of the clock, suddenly I have a new representation of time. So I was looking before at a digital representation, 1917, and now I'm looking at an analog representation on an actual circular clock. So one thing you always want to make sure you do is keep your times in this case, but whatever type of item that you're using, you want to keep it as consistent as possible. Another thing that's different is we had 1917 in military time, and now we have 717. And so those represent the same time because we use the PM, but we're not keeping it consistent the way that we're representing that time. So that's something to always think about as well. So how can we fix it? Oh, nope, that's not how we can fix it. Anyway, we'll go to a new one. So this is something called GIMP. I don't know if anyone's used it before, but it's a user interface for editing images. And one major thing that they did is they took away the menu bar that we usually see. Like on my Mac right now, you can see that I have this Chrome menu bar with a bunch of different menus. And that's something that people are really used to in their programs. But they took that away because they thought it's more efficient if you can bring up a menu bar right where you're already working, which is okay because I still see file and edit and select, but it's a little confusing for a new user because they have to figure out that they can find this menu bar and they don't just see it at the top of their screen like they're used to. Another thing that you can't see unless you're using it, but you have to slide over directly at a 90-degree angle horizontally from File to New in order to go down this submenu, If you go at an angle, then you'll end up opening a new submenu instead of the file submenu. So that makes it hard to use, even for a user who knows what they're doing, because it's not natural to move your mouse in a horizontal direction and then a vertical direction rather than at a diagonal. So there are a few issues there. Let's try one. We will skip that one. So as we've seen in some of these examples, usability can be really hard because when you're building, you're thinking about the functionality and not really thinking about how the user is actually going to use it. And we're used to, as developers, communicating with other developers. But the change here is that we want to communicate with users, and that doesn't necessarily mean communicating in the same way. Because when we're building a back end, we can tell other people what the functionality is, and we can use a lot of words because we're still building it. But when we give it to the user, we want it to be intuitive. And users aren't developers, so we can't give them the same accesses that we give to other developers. The other thing that's really difficult is even if you try to put yourself in the user's perspective, you already know how the interface works. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to find that obscure button or to understand that we went from using military time to a 12-hour time scale. So we need to remember that our users are always right. So if they make a mistake, it's because you did something in building your interface that confused them. It's not because because they're dumb or because they're doing it wrong. So it's easy to get frustrated and sort of blame the user because you think that you built your interface the right way the first time. But what we really need to do is take a step back and try to understand why the mistake was made. I'm going to go back to presenting. I think that's better. Okay. But another thing that's difficult is if we try to ask our users what they want, they often don't know because they aren't designers and they haven't been thinking about this. They're just living their lives using the tools that are available to them. They know their goals, but they don't necessarily know the best way to do it. And one thing that we sometimes try to do in order to fix that is we give the users as much access as we can so that they can make their own customizations. But again, they're not designers, and they don't necessarily know the best way, especially based in your ecosystem, in your backend that you've built. So they either won't do it, or they'll do it in a way that doesn't quite work with the system that you've designed. So a better way is to try to understand them and do the customization for them ahead of time. So one example of this is 50 years ago, telephones were pretty heavy. And so a company was trying to build a lighter telephone, and they asked office workers, would you prefer if your telephone was lighter? And most of them said no, they thought that their phone was just fine, they were used to the weight, it didn't bother them. But when the company just made a lighter telephone and put it on the desk, they found that these users actually preferred the lighter telephone. They just didn't realize that it would make their lives better. Another example is Google search results asked users how many results they wanted to see on a page. And most people said they wanted to see as many results as Google would let them, so 30. They asked them 10, 20, or 30, and most people thought they wanted to see the most that they could. But when they did an A/B test that they didn't tell the users about, so an A/B test is when you put a different interface in front of different users in a scientific way. So you select different segments of your population and show them different interfaces. So they put out 10 results, 20 results, and 30 results, and they found that if they put 30 results in front of a user, usage actually dropped by 20% versus 10. So again, the users didn't know what they really wanted, and Google kind of had to show them what they wanted. So why we focus on this is so that we can get new users into our programs, and they can learn the interface easily. And if they can use your interface easily the first time, then they'll remember it, and they'll come back to you because you saved them time and they were able to complete their goal without too much frustration. And in the future, the same usability design will save you time because you won't be trying to answer support requests or questions about how to use your user interface. And the way to do this is to know who your user is and what goals they have, so that you can design those specific goals the best way possible and make them as easy to use as possible. For your new users, you want to make sure that your experience is learnable and that if they make mistakes, they can correct them before it becomes an issue where they have to just start all over again. Once somebody's learned your design, then you want to make sure that they can perform those same tasks quickly the next time they come through. So if you make a really easy to learn design, but it has 10 steps, then the next time the user comes in, those steps are just going to frustrate them. So even if you have to break down the steps the first time, you may want to make a faster way to do it so that your returning users can use that more efficiently. So we discussed that there are other trade-offs to make with usability, such as keeping the amount of data that you're using low. And so all of the things that you're already thinking about when you're building a new program, all the functionality that you want, your performance in terms of battery and data, and quick requests if you're using a website with a backend, how much you're spending on it, making sure that it's secure, making sure that you can add new features. All of these things are important, and we want to include usability at that same level. So if you need to maybe remove a bit of functionality to make it more usable, then that's a trade-off that you can make because these two principles are at the same level of design. So we'll go back to the major principles, and this time we'll define them. So usability is our overall, how easy is it to use? But the first thing that goes into that is how easy is it to learn the first time a user comes in. And the second thing is efficiency. How fast is it to use once a user knows how to use it? And finally, safety. Can you recover from an error, either for a user who's learning or a user who already knows what they're doing, and maybe they just went too fast and made a mistake? So today, as I've said, the first thing we'll talk about is learnability. And this is another one where we want some interaction, so do this again. So this is RealCD. This is a program that was supposed to allow users to play music. So you put the CD into your computer, this program opens up, and you start to play songs. What issues do we see with learnability specifically? How would a user learn to use this program? So the whole program is in the image. You can see the CD cover art, and then on the side there's a few buttons. Right, so one thing is no text labels, which could be a good thing, right, because removing text is usually good. But if the labels don't tell you what they do, then you probably need to add some text. So that's definitely a usability issue. Yeah, another thing was color. So you could add some color, maybe. So it turns out that this is like the play button, but the little triangle without an extra line. There's a square, that's the stop button. But if you maybe had green for the play button or red for the stop button, that would make things a little more clear. Yep, so the green light at the top doesn't really make any sense. Like, who knows what it does? What it actually is it's the close button. So that's how you would close this program. which is also not something that users are used to. So most programs would have a red X for close, but this one has a green light. Another thing that, yeah, you don't know what it means at first is the squares. So right now it's on, it is showing you that the single square is depressed. So that button has been pressed, and so that's why right now we're only looking at the cover art. If you press the button with the 2 squares, what will happen is the CD case will open. But there's no way to know that the CD case is going to open because that button is not very clear about what it does. I think that's most of what's here. Let's see. Yeah, so one thing that's good about this is that we're using a metaphor. So a CD case is something that everybody's used to. And so something that you can use for learnability is an object that exists in the real world or another interface that most people have already used. And you can try to duplicate some of that functionality, and that'll help your users learn. But the problem here is that they went too far. They started with a CD case, and then they just threw all the other functionality that they needed on top of it, like the play button and the stop button, and then the 2 buttons for navigating between songs, forward and back. All of those are things that they needed to have, but they're not things that are included on a CD case. So this metaphor probably wasn't the right choice for this program. So see what else we've got. Once we open the case, there's some other issues. This one's a little harder to see, so we'll just talk about it. Actually, I'll leave those up. So once we open it, we expect that we can navigate through the songs. So if you have more than 15 songs, you can't see all of them at first. But it's hard to tell how we would get to the next row of songs. So at the bottom, there's actually a little green trapezoid or hexagon thing. And so that actually turns out to be how you scroll through new songs, but it's a horizontal scroll when the songs are listed vertically. So that doesn't really make sense. A user would expect that they can scroll vertically to scroll a vertical list, but instead they have a horizontal scroll bar. It is good that there's this little tick that shows which song we're on, so it's pointing at track 1 right now. So that's good. We know which song we're listening to. Another issue is that right now, this is the first time we've been able to see our volume controls. So until you open the CD case, which was hard to find the button for, the little square button, you can't even see the volume controls. So that's another problem. Another issue is there's actually a help menu that you can find if you want to click around for it. Does anybody have a guess where the help menu is? The help menu is actually if you click on the IBM picture at the bottom of the cover art. But again, that already existed. That little IBM symbol was already on the front page, and you couldn't actually click it then. But on the second page, you can suddenly click on this IBM logo, and it will show you a help menu. So it's a consistency issue where the help menu should have been available on the first page if it was going to be on the second. And there also probably should have been some affordance for it. There should have been something that told me that I could maybe click here and something would happen. So maybe peel up the corner of the cover art or something like that at least when I hover over it, so that I have an idea that I could click on it. Okay, so learning approaches. So that one that we just talked about was using metaphor. And as we saw, that can actually be pretty hard because you start to think too much about the metaphor and not enough about the actual design and functionality of your application. So if you're going to use metaphor, be really, really careful and make sure that you're not taking it too far and making it more confusing. And another thing is try to use maybe other applications that already exist, metaphors in the technology space or in the application space rather than in the physical world, because that'll be easier to duplicate without accidentally confusing people. Another thing is manuals, but those are really tough because users don't read them. In fact, most users don't even read pop-ups that you put in front of them on a mobile app or on a web application. So that's another reason to use as little text as possible because users probably aren't going to read it. They're going to click around, they're going to explore instead. Users really learn interfaces by exploration and trying to complete a task, not by studying beforehand. Another thing that is less common now, but definitely with corporate software is possible, is that there could be classes on how to use the program. For instance, Excel, there are classes at universities about how to use Microsoft Excel. But in a lot of cases, people don't actually take the classes or they don't pay attention because they think, oh, it's just a computer program. I'll be able to figure it out once I get there. Which could be true, but we can't assume that people are going to take the classes or understand them. So as I said, users go into an application with a task in mind. They click, they type, they explore to try to find out how they can complete that task. And the learning sort of happens as they complete their task. Another thing they might do is Google as they complete their task, and we'll talk about how you can use that to your advantage. And so the user interface should know this, and as the user is trying to find their task, find the steps that they need to take, the interface should also be helping them learn. So this is where you can bring up little tooltips or highlight things as they're clicking, try to give them some suggestions, or just keep things, different tasks as consistent as possible so that they're repeating the same actions and really reinforcing the learning that they're doing. So because they're coming in with tasks, you should know ahead of time what your users might want to do when they come into your application. So for something like that GIMP application, the photo editing application, one thing that you might know that they're going to want to do is crop their photo. So try to make that task quick to find and easy to use. Or let's see, for the setting the time in a alarm application, try to make, I don't know, as few steps as possible to change the time. And any help that you provide, tooltips or frequently asked questions, anything like that should also be centered around these goals so that the user doesn't have to search through a bunch of questions that aren't relevant to them before they find the answer to what they want to know. So a few ways you can try to learn your users' goals are by using Google, like I mentioned. So a common thing that I'll do that many users do is if they can't find the answer to their question or figure out how to complete their task, they'll go and search on Google. And another thing they'll do is watch other users. So one thing, this works to your advantage if you run a user test because you can watch your user try to learn your application. And so you'll actually kind of put yourself in their shoes by watching them. And users will also watch each other. So if you find a new application that you really like, you might show it to your friend. And so they'll watch you use it first, and that will help them learn when they actually download or go to that application and use it themselves. So let's do a quick exercise. Pick an application that you use or that you've found confusing and just type in the name of the application and then how to, and see what Google gives you for some things that people have trouble with in that application. And send me a quick message about what you found. Okay, I'll try one so I can give you guys an example. So I had some issues in Xcode this morning. So if I say Xcode how to, Google suggests build, add framework, debug, run simulator. So these are some actually basic things that you need to do in Xcode. So build is building your application. That's pretty major because if you can't build, then you're not going to be able to test anything that you've just written in your code. I think actually that Xcode does an okay job with this. So there's this play button in the top left. So that's actually pretty easy to find. But apparently it's not that usable for other users. And it could be that because I've written a lot of code and used a lot of different development environments, I know what that button means and a new user may not. So maybe that's something that Xcode should try to work on. We had one user, or one student, try how to, or WebEx how to, and they found share screen, mute all, and give control. So this is actually something that we ran into trying to set up this class today. Screen sharing was the main issue. So I'm not surprised that Google auto-suggested share screen as the first thing that people Google about WebEx. So this is a good way if you're having trouble with usability or that you just want to know what your users are having trouble with, you can try on Google and see what they're searching for. Okay, let's keep going. I don't know. I don't know if I'm, yes, I am talking, good. Okay, so yeah. So how do we communicate things to the user without words or without sitting right next to them and telling them how to use our application. So I talked about using metaphor, using things that users already know, like with the Xcode button, the play button that means build. That's something that's pretty common across different types of programming interfaces. So that's something that I recognize from Android Studio, and Xcode used the same button. It's a play button, so everyone is used to that from watching videos, from playing music. So it makes sense that the play button would be used basically to say, play my code, play my program that I just wrote. So using things like that that people already know that are visual are really helpful, because as humans, we recognize visual things a lot easier than we read, a sentence or a paragraph. And it's also helpful for things like internationalization, which we'll talk about later, or maybe users who can't read, because we're not using any words. So they just have to recognize a shape, not a whole word. And then recall is something that the user has to know, maybe from school or something else. A lot of times this is something like a command line interface. So if you haven't used something like that, here's mine. So something that I use a lot is Git. So I know if I want to see like what I've written for code so far, I can type git status. And right now I've written no code in this repository. But that's a command that I know in my head. And so that's what recall is, something that the user has to remember. So that's a little harder. That's more for your users who have come back and have already learned your interface. So that's a command language example. I'll recall. You need to have error messages. So in that same case, if I had typed something, I didn't complete my word. So then they have an error message that says, this is not a command, and then it gives me some options of things that I might have meant to type. So that's important because now I also have recognition along with my recall. I started with recall, I got it wrong, and now the interface is giving me something that I can recognize, and now I know that I have to type git status. So the next one, menus and forms. So people are pretty used to having a menu at the top of any application. So keeping the same categories like file and edit and view, that can be pretty important. And using some icons in there can help with visual cues. Yeah, all of those things help users to categorize the tasks that they're looking for. So I wouldn't look under file for something like undo, right? Because that's an edit action. Direct manipulation is really nice because it's all visual. So a user clicks on an object and moves it across the screen. So they immediately know that they're making the action that they wanted to make. This is something like cropping a photo. So I can see the lines drawn on the screen of what my crop is going to look like before I even press the button that actually makes the crop. And then speech dialogues, the user has to know what it can ask, and the program has to know what things it can respond with. So that's a little bit of recall, but there's also recognition because you're directly helping the user with the speech that you send back. Okay, so something you can do is combine some of these. So for instance, Siri uses that speech dialogue, so the user has to know what it can say to Siri. For instance, wake me up in an hour. You wouldn't necessarily say to Siri, I don't know, I don't use Siri, so I don't know what I can say to her or not. But some things that you say to Siri, she'll say, I don't understand, right? So you kind of have to know what commands you can give her. But then if you give her a command she doesn't understand, she gives you some feedback, I don't understand. So if you say something to Siri that she does know how to do, sometimes she'll give you something like this form where you can turn on an alarm for the next hour. So this combines both the speech dialogue and the menus and forms interaction styles. that's a good thing to do as well. This is another way to combine recognition and recall. So as you can see here, this is something like an Excel. So for recognition, you have the word sum, the word average, count numbers. These are all math applications that, or math functions that we know how to use. So sum will add up all the numbers in the column, right? So, but as soon as you click this, the application is giving you the recall command that you could have typed instead. So as you use the recognition interface to find sum, it's also giving you a recall command that as you become a more experienced user, you can start to type these commands instead. So Google Advanced Search does something similar where it has a bunch of text edits for you to change the filters that you want to use. And it also shows you how you could have typed that command. So that next time you come in, you could maybe just type the command without using the full interface. So this is a good way to help the user become a recall user rather than a recognition user. So one thing we can call these two things is, so recall is knowledge in the head. What does the user have to know before they start using your application? And then knowledge in the world is the recognition. What can the user find out as they're using your application? So let's talk about over chat. What in Twitter is knowledge in the head? So what things does the user have to know before they come into Twitter? But then what can they, what does the user have to know before they come in order to create a new tweet? Right, so the user just has to know how to enter a tweet. And also, right, and how to send it, yep. And they probably need to know what they want to say. So, but that's outside of the interface, right? That's that's the user's, the action that they want to take. So those things are pretty standard. So they use a text box and a tweet button. So those things make sense. Now let's think about what is knowledge in the world. So what can the user learn from this interface, these two pictures that I have on the screen, about sending a tweet? Mm-hmm. Right, so they know how to type from knowledge in the head, and then to enter the text, we've given them this text box that tells them where to enter it. That's good. That's knowledge in the world. What about, yes, so there we go. So you can see other tweets here. So what can a user learn from looking at other tweets? Mm-hmm. You could learn what topics other users are interested in, sure. Okay, sharing, yep. You can see that people have retweeted, people have replied, yep. Yeah, you can see user tags. So you might experiment with using the @ sign and see what it does because you've seen it in other tweets. And the same thing with hashtags, right? And links, you can see that people have put links in them. So these are all things that you might not realize could go in tweets originally, but you can see from other users' tweets and you learn from each other. And the buttons showing, retweeted by, and then seeing the button retweet with the same visual cue, the same two arrows in a circle. That's a good way to show recognition. And the user, you never had to directly tell the user this in text. They just saw that somebody had retweeted something and then later on saw the same visual cue to retweet their own content. So that's a really good way of teaching the user without ever having to say anything. Okay, good. So now for something completely different. So far we've talked about how users learn from exploring and watching, but let's talk about what that knowledge, what that learning actually looks like in our brains. So we'll talk about the model that we create of our user interface. So when a user comes in and starts learning your application, they're creating a mental model of what the application does and where to find things in the application. So there's actually 3 models that exist. The one that the user is creating is the user model. So that's how they think the system works. So that's how they visualize it and know where to find things and think about how to find the next thing that they don't actually know where it is yet, but based on this model that they've created, they have some idea of where they might look for it. So behind that is the interface model. So that's what we're building here, how we present the user interface to the user. So how we take the system and we build on top of it to give the user this interface they can work with. And then the user takes that and turns it into their own model. And even beneath the interface model is the system model. So that's what's actually happening in code behind the scenes. So that's not really what we're concerned with here, but we definitely have to work with it because we take that system model and figure out how to present it to the user in a user interface so that the user can then learn from it and build their own model in their own head. So it's pretty complex there with 3 separate models that build on top of each other. And it's kind of like a game of telephone. I don't know if that's something that people play here, but in the US we have this game as a little kid where the first person will say some sentence and they'll whisper it in the ear of the next person. who will whisper it in the ear of the next person, and that'll keep going until the end when the last person has to say what they heard. And a lot of times the sentence has completely changed over the game of telephone. So this is kind of the same thing, where the system model starts as one thing, and then we change it a little bit to turn it into a user interface. And then the user comes to it and changes it again when they create their own user model in their head. And the user model can be different for all of our users. Our goal is to make it as uniform as possible and make as much sense as possible to our user. Okay, so let's talk about an example. So this is pretty common in web browsers that we have to navigate between pages. So when you search in Google, you're going to come up with thousands of answers, and you're not going to put all of those on the same page. So in this case, we're looking at Google with 12 different pages of search results. And we can navigate between them by using these next and previous buttons, or clicking on the button for the number of the page that we want, right? So that makes a lot of sense just by itself. Previous, next, all these pages to click on. I know as a user, my user model is pretty easy to build. If I'm on page 3 and I click next, I expect to be on page 4. If I click previous, I expect to be on page 2. If I click the number 8, I expect to be on page 8. And then once I'm on page 8, I expect next and previous to work the exact same way and take me to 9 if I click next and 7 if I click previous. Makes sense. But then we add in this button that the browser has called back, and we also have a next button there as well, or forward button. So now we've added this extra piece to the model. So it's not quite so simple as I'm going to go to page 4 from page 3, and then if I click back, where do I go? So in that case, it's pretty simple. I clicked next from page 3 and I got to page 4. But then I clicked back and I went back to page 3, which is what I'd expect, the same thing as previous. But what happens if I'm on page 3 and I click previous and go to page 2? What do I expect back to do? Right, so because we've used browsers, we know that the back button will now take us to page 3. But at first, a user who hasn't used a browser before might get confused and think that back is going to do the same thing as previous and take us to page 1. So this is an example where a user could get confused by the difference between back and previous, and their user model might not be the same thing as our interface model. Because when we clicked previous, then back becomes the same thing as next rather than the same thing as previous. So let's think about another example. So there are other conceptual models out there that aren't related to computers at all that are also incorrect. So a lot of people, if you haven't studied physics or electrical engineering extensively, you might understand electricity as kind of like a faucet, like a flow through a hose. So you think about it like it's water, and it's flowing through the hose and coming out the other end. But what really happens with electricity is the electrons in the wire just move back and forth, and that creates the flow rather than moving continuously through the wire. But for most people, this doesn't really matter because you flick the switch and the light turns on, and that's all you care about. But we need to think about this in our interfaces because sometimes it actually does cause a problem. So like with this thermostat on the side, so this is a way of turning up your heat. And right now it's set at, let's see, 66. So this is Fahrenheit, sorry. A lot of people think because of the way this thermostat is designed, that if you turn up, that it works like a valve. So if you turn up the heat higher, maybe to 72, then the heat will come on stronger. They don't think of it like a switch, which is how it actually works. So if I turn it up to 66, the same amount of heat will be on as if I put it at 72. So let's think about some ways that we could fix this. So how could we redesign the thermostat so that people understand it to be a switch rather than a valve? Yeah, we could have an indicator for it. I think that's a good one. Having an actual switch probably doesn't make sense because then the user would have to actually flip the switch in order to turn the heat on, and that's not what we want. We want it to be automatic. So I think an on-off light indicator makes the most sense. Okay, so let's talk about some learnability principles. So these are some major things. We've already talked about them a little bit as we went through examples that make your interface more learnable. So consistency, we've talked about with the difference in the time representations in the alarm application. So that was internal consistency. So you want all the representations of time within our application to be the same. And that helps the user recognize that this is referring to the same object within our application. And with external, that was like with the Xcode example, using that play button that looks like other coding interfaces and also looks like, playing a movie or something like that. So that's consistency with other products out there in the world already so that the user can recognize something that's familiar to them the first time they use your application. And then metaphorical, again, that was like the real CD. And that one's difficult to do and definitely want to be careful with it, but it can be a very powerful tool if you can make it work. And then affordances, we talked about this a little bit, like with buttons. When you press them, you want them to push down. You want them to actually perform an action. And there's two parts to this. So when you press down on a button, that makes the user think that, okay, I have made this action happen. So that's why you want to make sure that the action actually happens, because that's the actual affordance, what happens in the application. And finally, feedback, and that's when the action happens, you want the user to know that it happened immediately so that they don't keep pressing that button and cause issues with your interface or just get frustrated. So go a little bit more into consistency. So metaphorical consistency could connect to something that the user's already used to, like a physical object or an application that they've already used. You don't want to stretch for it, like I've already said. And you want to find and choose very carefully the points where your metaphor is not going to work. So for instance, in a word processor, they sort of set it up like a typewriter. So the user can watch the characters go across the screen. And the thing that's different, and they made a point of doing differently, the user doesn't have to tell it when to go to the next line. So on a typewriter, you had to press a button that would make the page move back and start a new line. But in a word processor, it's automatic, so the user doesn't have to make that action. And that was a major point that they chose not to use the metaphor anymore because it makes for a better user experience. But you don't want to do that too often because then you've lost your metaphor. You just want to choose the points at which it's really important that you do something a different way. But metaphor can also mislead the user, for instance, in the case of Real CD, where a CD case can't actually play the CD. So when you first go into that application, you may not realize that the application is meant to play music because the metaphor that they used is just an inanimate object. And it can be limiting. For instance, in our Finder windows, where we keep all of our documents on our computers, there's usually a limit to how many folders you can put inside each other. In real life, you could put as many folders as you wanted nested together. But on the computer, we have to set a limitation. And so you want to make sure that your metaphors aren't limiting your application, because computers can do so much more than real-world objects, and we want to take advantage of that. Some things you can do with internal consistency. You want to make sure that you map your controls as closely as possible to where they are physically. So something like when you're on your stove at home, it'll show you a little picture of which burner you're turning on when you turn the dial. And usually that directly maps down onto the flat surface of the stove, so you can tell which burner from that picture. Another way to do this is natural mapping. So in the car, when you turn on your turn signal, your hand moves in the direction that you're going to be turning the signal on. So if your hand is moving to the right, then you're going to turn on your right blinker. If your hand is moving to the left, you're going to turn on your left blinker. And of course, you want to be using the same words for the same objects within your application. So if you're on a different page, you want to use the same word for an action as you used on the previous page. External consistency has the same thing, where you want to be using the same words as another application, or the same images that are really common. You don't want to use words that the user's never heard before, because they'll just ignore that functionality completely. And if you're working in a specific ecosystem, like in Android, there's usually guidelines for how apps normally look and work, and the users will be used to how that user flow goes. And so you should try to follow that as closely as possible so that it feels like a complete experience with the rest of the phone. Affordances are properties that determine what an item does. So things like a button, people are used to buttons looking like they pop out of the screen, to when you click on them, they change color so you know that you clicked them. And people have lots of experience with these things. We make assumptions about what an object does every time we look at something. If you look at a bottle, you assume that there's a cap that screws off. If you look at a marker, you assume that you can use it to write on a whiteboard. These are all things that people learn just from living in the world every day. So you want to make sure that when you use something like that, that the user is going to make an assumption about what it does, that it actually does that thing. We'll skip the question for now. So here are some examples. Like a chair tells you that you can probably sit here based on the fact that there's a flat surface, it looks sturdy, there's a place for your arms. A scroll bar gives you arrows to show that you can probably move this little rectangle from left to right. There's also, based on experience, you have the idea that you can probably grab that rectangle and slide it left to right. So if you put a scroll bar in your application, you want to make sure that it can actually be slid left to right that way. In a list like this, where one of the items is highlighted, you want to make sure that items can actually be clicked on, because that's the affordance for a list with highlights like that. As we talked about with the time application, if you have a text box where text can be highlighted, that text should also be able to be edited. This is a real-world example where it doesn't actually do what you think it would. So this door, of course, it looks like a pull handle, but the wording says push. So things like that are very confusing for users and will make them frustrated with your design. Some things in software, we've talked about buttons a lot. There's also links. Blue is a pretty common color for a link, but really any color that doesn't match the text will give an affordance that that thing is important, at least, if not actually clickable. Underlines also help. Usually, if you hover over a link, it will change color or become bold or lose its underline, something like that. For drop-downs, arrows, sometimes having an edit box looking text field. For scroll bars and corners that are clickable, so a corner like this with a little bit of texture gives the affordance that I can probably change the size of the window using that corner. And for scroll bars, that little bit of texture tells me that I can grab and click this. Mouse cursors, people are pretty used to, and as you can see, they can change based on the mode that the user is in. So we're used to having a text cursor look like this eye. If you have a hand, that probably means whatever you're hovering on is clickable. The 4 arrows tells me that I can move this object. The 2 arrows tells me that I can change the size of this object. These are all affordances that people are used to and you should make use of when designing an application. And of course, highlights, again, are really important for letting people know which action is going to happen when they click and that they can click here. And so feedback, once the user decides to click on something, you want to make sure that they immediately know that that action has happened. So with buttons, you provide the feedback from the object itself by changing the color, by making it look like it's been pushed in. Same thing with links, sometimes they'll change color. Let's see, what else could we have? When you're changing the size of a window, the object immediately resizes. And I'm sure you've seen in some applications where maybe there's a lag on that. You'll notice that it hasn't happened yet, and you'll sort of get worried that it doesn't work or that you've done something wrong. So you want to make sure that that happens as quickly as possible. And for high level, you're changing the state of that user model that we talked about. So if a user is on a web page, they're thinking in their head, where in the model they are. Their location is this web page. And when they click on a new web page, it should start to load the new page so that the user knows that, okay, my model is changing. I've moved to a new location within the site. So that's the high level feedback. And as I said, you want to make sure that this feedback is visible, that it is happening wherever the user is focused at the time, which may be the button that they're clicking on. It may be something that they're reading. It may be the menu bar. So you want to think about where the user will be focused right now. And oftentimes that might not be exactly where you think. So user testing can help with that because you can tell if your users notice the feedback that you're giving them when you're in this test. You can actually ask them that question too. Yeah, and another thing, yeah, don't be overdoing it. If you're popping up a lot of alert dialogues that say, oh, I just did that for you, whatever, they'll start to ignore them and then they'll miss the important feedback like errors that you're trying to give them. Okay, so for high-level feedback, something like navigation, like we talked about in the Google search results, these are things that can sort of be out of maybe the direct field of view for a user, but are still visible to them if they want to check. So like changing a tab, a user may not directly be looking at the tab when it changes, but they can quickly check and they know where to look to see that the tab has actually changed. So highlighting a tab like this with a different color for the tab that they're actually viewing. And also for pages, changing the color of the page that they're on, all of these things are pretty clear. Things like moving an image or knowing which image, say in a Google slide that you're currently clicked on, that's also a high-level feedback issue. And again, the user may not be focused on the box itself, but the fact that the box is there around the image that they're focused on tells them that they have actually changed the model and they're now making changes to a different object than they were before. Let's see. Okay, so this is the part about recognizing that feedback was caused by the action they just made. So humans have a certain amount of expectation for how quickly things are going to happen when they perform an action. To us, about 1/10 of a second feels like it happened instantaneously when we clicked that button, when we dragged that corner to make the window bigger. This is like the science behind why these things need to happen. If it doesn't happen within 1/10 of a second, it's okay. About up to a second, the user will still associate the change, the feedback, with the action that they just made. They'll just notice a little bit of a delay. And it might be a little frustrating if it happens all the time, but they'll probably forgive you for a few times. 1 to 5 seconds, you should probably show a busy indicator. If you're loading something like an image, the user wanted to see an image a bit larger or something like that, you can give them a little busy signal to say, I'm working on it. But if you don't, then they'll probably start clicking again and again, which could cause issues for your application, or they may decide to just leave and assume that it's not working. So try to, if you know that it's going to take a while for an action to complete, try to give them an indication that it is working, it just needs a minute. And then if it's going to be more than 5 seconds, you should probably show a progress bar, like for a download, so that they know that it's happening over time and that eventually it will complete, and they won't, again, keep clicking or they won't give up entirely. Just let them know that you're working on it. Okay, yeah, changing tax again. So as we talked about, users learn by exploring. So we need to make sure that we give them a chance to find the right places to explore. And we can do that a few different ways, and each one of them has a little more work behind it for the user. So we start with glances, and these are the really simple things to do, like a play button that they know already, things like icons, as small and still clear as possible, single words, links, all of those things users can get just by skimming your application. It's like when you skim a news article, you pick out a few words, you get the basic idea of what the article is about, and you decide if you want to read it. So this is where we're telling them what our application is about and a few of the things that they can do with it, the major important things that they can do with it, so that they know if they want to keep going, and they can start to explore more closely by reading any descriptions or keywords or taglines that we've put in. So these should be a few words, maybe a sentence, to help them get a better idea of what this actually does. Captions for buttons, things like that. And then as they start to actually move the cursor around, that's where we get hover effects. So you can show them buttons they could click on, links they could click on, things like tooltips. So if there's an icon that's not totally clear, this is where you give them a short description when they hover over the icon so that they know if they want to click on it or not. For clicking things, this is a little more intensive because a new window will probably pop up, or maybe something entirely new will load. So that's definitely a lot more work for the user, and you want to make sure that you don't put some of the major items involved in your interface on a second page or on a dialog. You want to have as many things on the first page that they're going to see as possible without overwhelming them. We'll get to that in the graphic design part. You want to make sure you're also not overloading so that they can't get any information because there's just too much to see at a first glance. And then finally, invoke is all that feedback that we just talked about that actually changes the model. You want that to happen as late as possible because it is a lot of work for the user to revise their mental model of what your application does. So that's the last thing that you want to do. So let's look at some good and bad examples. The first one, it's pretty good. You know, there's some links that we can see where we might be able to learn more, but there's a lot of words in order to get to the point that we know what the link is about. When I first glance at this, I see click here, here, more, and about. But I don't know what any of those things refer to. And it turns out that all of them mean learn more about this site. So I'm not going to get any of that information at first glance. I'm just going to see something that's telling me to click a lot of places. So that's not very good. A way to fix that is this on the right, you can see that the whole learn more about this site is underlined in a link. So I'll actually read that on a first glance, and I'll know that I can click here to learn more. About is even better because it's a single word that I know I can click here and get more information. On the bottom, we see a list of some categories, maybe for like a store, an online store that we can look at. And the first one is okay. There isn't a whole lot of text. There's good categories. I can kind of tell what each of these is. So that's actually okay. But the second one is better because I still have these bolded categories at a first glance, but then there's a little more information too. If I decide, for instance, that I want books, I saw that on a first glance, and now I can explore further with the description that's right next to it. So that's both the glance and the read part of the information sent page that we talked about. So, okay, this is kind of a final exercise. Pretty difficult task to think about. So a lot of times you may want to have more than one monitor on your screen, but it can be really confusing to know how to get your mouse cursor over to that monitor, or how to move maybe a new window onto the monitor. So I just want us to think about how we could help a user learn to do those things. From first attaching the monitor, is there a way when the user first attaches a new monitor that we could tell them how, like, which side of the screen will move the mouse onto that new screen? Yeah, what things could we do to make this experience more learnable? Okay, so yeah, we could have it be left to right. So if you slide your cursor to the right of the screen, it'll automatically go onto the next monitor. But how do I know which of, so in this picture I have 3 monitors. I have my laptop, and then I have two external monitors? How do I know when I first slide to off the right edge of the screen which external monitor I'm going to? Right, that's what I would like it to do, but it's hard to tell the computer which monitor is to the right, right? So the laptop doesn't understand where I've positioned my external monitors. Okay, yes, so I could have the user set that in settings, but then the user has to be able to find the settings and has to be able to understand them. So is there any way when a user connects a monitor that I could tell them which side of the screen that the laptop understands that monitor is on? Okay, right. So maybe there's some kind of number in the corner of one of the external monitors that could say which side of the screen. Another option might be you could quickly flash a little, I don't know, green light or something on the side of the laptop screen that this new monitor is going to be set at. And then if I want to change that, then I could go to settings and change that. That would be good feedback, right? So the user would immediately see once they've connected a new monitor, okay, this monitor right now, the computer thinks is on the right. And so they can decide if they want to change that. So yeah, there are some good options there to use settings, to use affordances on the screen, to use I think those are the major ones. Cool. So for optional work, we're a little early, but I'll wrap up. So then if you have any questions before I go, we can go into those. So this link, if you want to take a picture or write it down, this is where the document for the lab will be. You can submit it to me if you want to. This is my email. But the main idea of the lab is to go and look at applications on your computer or websites that you use or applications on your phone and just analyze them for, oh yes, I can post it. Good idea. So the main idea of the lab is to find these applications and to analyze them for their usability and specifically learnability. And after the lecture on Tuesday on efficiency and safety, you could go back and do some analysis that way as well. My message doesn't seem to be sending. Hopefully it sends. But just for yourself to think about some of the things that we talked about today and see if you can find and maybe even think of some ideas to fix examples that already exist. Because there's plenty of user interfaces out there that are not great. Did you take the survey? Could you send your email in this chat so that I can email it to you? I can post the survey link as well. Great. Okay. So I think that is everything. Have fun with the lab, and I hope I will see you on Tuesday. If you have any questions, send them to me right now. I'll be here for another 5 or 10 minutes, and happy to answer anything. The schedule for offline is here. So we have Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And that will be starting tomorrow, all of next week, and all of the week after. The actual syllabus is here, so it's pretty much the same. The major thing that's different is that next week there's a lab on Friday. And so for this week, I put 3 lectures, and it'll all depend on how much we get through. We may be able to combine internationalization and accessibility and just not go quite as in-depth. So we might be able to cover most of the same material, but this is the offline class. Ooh, good question. I'm not sure what we're going to do about availability online. I can talk to Marisol, and I can tell you more on Tuesday. Definitely the labs next week are not going to be available online. It would have to be entirely done by you, because those are building a paper prototype and testing with real users. So in class, in offline class, we'll be testing with each other. If you wanted to do it online, then you could test on friends or whoever you wanted. Great. I will hopefully see you on Tuesday. Thanks for coming.